The process of including people who reject or are aloof to dialogue is really to take it very slowly, step by step, and to make the efforts to go towards them and show an interest that is not instrumental, by the way. It's a really genuine interest in learning more about them and their communities and what's important to them.
Bonjour from Paris. Join us today with Professor Patrice Bourdour, an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Montreal. My name is Eliaz El-Hosseini, and this is another episode of Trending Echoes, where we will unlock the key understandings of interfaith dialogue. Bonjour from Paris, the city of enlightenment and culture, but also from the heart of France's most significant cultural event, the Paris International Book Fair. We are here today for another episode of Trending Echoes, diving deep into the trends of the current world. My name is Eliaz El-Hosseini, and on this journey today we'll unlock the keys to understanding the dynamic landscape of interreligious dialogue. Joining us today is Professor Patrice Bourdour, an esteemed Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Montreal. And together today we'll explore the intersection of faith, culture, and society, unraveling the mysteries that bind us all here today. Let's all get ready to embark on a journey of discovery in this episode of Trending Echoes. Good morning, Professor Patrice.
Good morning, bonjour, as we say in Paris, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to say that I appreciate meeting you as well. Eliazia, tشرفنا.
الشرف لي. It is both an honor and a privilege. Honestly, I'm just going to deep dive and just straight to the question. Professor Patrice, who do you, in your opinion, believe is involved in the interreligious dialogue of the current world, and who is missing?
Well, first of all, there are many, many people and many organizations that are involved internationally, globally. And one of the success stories of the 20th century that has its rippling effects in the 21st century is precisely the paradigm shift by most religious traditions towards dialogue, embracing dialogue, opening up to the value of respecting religious differences across centuries of what has often been religious misunderstandings, stereotypes, and of course conflicts at times. The beauty of the later part, the second half of the 20th century, has been sort of the emergence of a worldwide dialogue movement by major religious organizations that is now trickling down to include many smaller religious organizations. Not all yet, but definitely all major religions today are definitely fully backing an openness of respect and tolerance, using dialogue as the primary tool, as a primary means to foster conversations, better understanding, and when possible, collaboration.
So we all know that dialogue is there, but why do you believe the dialogue is there for?
The dialogue is there precisely because we all share in different ways a history of misunderstanding, of negative judgments of each other's positions and understanding of reality, as well as sometimes different interpretations within our different religious traditions. So today, I would say that the dialogue is both interreligious as well as intra-religious. Every religion has also challenges within itself to make sense of diverse interpretations. And sometimes that dialogue within the family is sometimes even more difficult than the dialogue outside of the family with people of other religious traditions. And so that's one of the challenges today, is to balance the intra and interreligious dialogue because both are complementary.
So what do you believe is the base of the inter-religious dialogue and the intra-religious dialogue?
The basis for it is the same, and these are what are often called the 10 principles of dialogue. Of course, the number doesn't matter so much, but it's about sort of creating a safe space for people to encounter one another on an individual, personal level, even if they are actually wearing a hat in the sense of representing an organization of one form or another. But whether they are speaking in their own personal name or whether they are speaking in the name of an organization, of a religious community, or of an interreligious organization, or a broader sort of umbrella religious organization, people actually need to feel comfortable. They need to feel that when they talk and dialogue with each other, there needs to be a safe space. That's the first grounding principle. Without that safe space, then of course it's very hard to trust sort of what and how far you can talk for all kinds of reasons. That's one. Then of course you need to agree on the purpose of the dialogue. You also need to set the ground rules of how you're going to talk, because saying word dialogue is one thing, but how is dialogue different from a conversation? And dialogue, for example, is one whereby you actually must aim to have a mutual relatedness, a mutual sharing of information, of questions, and that mutuality leads, therefore, to mutual learning about each other. It shouldn't be one-sided, who one person or one organization sends somebody to represent themselves, but not to learn about the other side. So that's one thing. Another example or another principle is the principle of speaking honestly, often, if possible, from an I perspective, especially if you're only yourself, then that's easy. If you're an organization, it's a little bit more challenging, but nevertheless, one can say that my understanding of my organization's position on a topic X is the following. And therefore, by keeping the I perspective, we avoid generalizations, both about ourselves and the organizations if we do represent them, but also when we talk to others, I think it's easier for them to see that you are only one voice within that broad religion and or organization.
So when talking about dialogue, you talked about talking to each other, but having this open mind and open space to accept what's coming back.
Yes.
What do you think, because you're a professor and you're specialized, so I'm sure you face many students come in and out, but how would you face students that are closed when coming to this dialogue?
Thank you, because this is one of the most important questions, because often people accuse the practitioners of dialogue like myself and so many thousands of others to be preaching to the converted, to be preaching to people who are already open, already interested, curious to learn about other religious traditions. And definitely there's learning to be done in that context, because we all come with some stereotypes and sometimes misunderstanding and sometimes even negative judgments, and that's okay. But reaching out to people who initially don't want to be included, don't want to be at the table, even if they're invited, that is the challenge number one today. And that's why sometimes it's not enough to invite people to the table of dialogue. Sometimes you have to leave the table of dialogue, go out to where they are, to their communities, meet with them on their turf, and show some interest in what they are, what they think, what's important to them. And through that, you commit yourself in beginning a relationship that actually might lead them to trust you enough that they might join your table of dialogue. Or you bring other people as well with you eventually, slowly but surely. The process of including people who reject or are aloof to dialogue is really to take it very slowly, step by step, and to make the efforts to go towards them and show an interest that is not instrumental, by the way. It's a really genuine interest in learning more about them and their communities and what's important to them. Often, those resistances, especially for certain kinds of dialogue, sometimes you're open to one religious community but not to another religious tradition. The reasons are probably either historical or they come from recent development in local dynamics that mean there's been a degree of discrimination of one form or another, and they feel hurt. There's different levels of trauma, maybe even, and therefore they're very suspicious and careful about why you're there, why you're coming to them, and that's why we need to be extremely sensitive to their understanding and feelings. So, another aspect of the principles of dialogue is to bring out those feelings, bring out those understandings that people have about their own reality and that of others, and through the mutual sharing, ask honest questions. Sometimes those questions are difficult to articulate because they are rooted in stereotypes or in negative judgments. But when the space is safe, it is possible to actually slowly, carefully allow yourself to express those questions as well as listen to answers. And it is through that mutual back and forth that eventually there can be, and that's another piece of the principles, is to learn that through dialogue, you're going to begin to change some of your perceptions about others. And believe it or not, over time, even sometimes about yourself. You learn to better articulate who I am in the dialogue. And so there's really multiple learnings and benefits from dialogue for all the people who are involved if they are practicing it from a genuine perspective, which again is something that doesn't happen overnight. That's preaching to those who are converted already to that. But it happens sometimes over years, especially inter-organizational dialogue that is built over years, and it's not a steady, smooth path either. Sometimes you have ups and downs, as we are now experiencing. So I think it's important to recognize that the dialogue is ongoing, and another principle is the principle of making sure that at the end of the day, it's never about who's right and who's wrong, but rather to better understand, even if you agree to disagree on certain basic fundamental beliefs or perspectives about reality. But the principle that is so important is you keep at it. You don't give up, even if you disagree, because the relationship comes first. You have to understand that dialogue, you privilege the human relationship, and that's for the long term.
I always say interreligious dialogue is not only about being tolerant, but to also be like it rises with empathy, goes down to a human level, people level.
Can I just, this is really important what you just said, Riazia, because understanding is at an intellectual level, and that's one aspect, and that's often where we begin. But if we want to deepen the quality, do what we call deep dialogue, then we need to surface the emotions and deal with that. And empathy is one of the skills that you end up developing over time.
Of course. By
recognizing with calmness in yourself and the ability to learn to listen to perspective which you either never thought of or are really going against what you think is the truth. You learn to deal with your own emotions in reaction, in facing those different perspectives, and eventually you begin to discover that under those differences, there might be actually similarities of lived experience emotionally, of traumas, the nature of which is completely different. But the result on the human psyche, on the emotional disturbances, is the same. And therefore, the emotions can also become a bridge for connecting to people over differences. And that is part of the essence that helps establish eventually the trust necessary for the collaboration out there, because multi-faith, interreligious dialogue, collaborative efforts and activities are much more powerful than if mono-religious activities against discrimination of one sort or another are being done. When they are done in a multi-religious way, it carries, I think, a greater weight, because especially in secular societies, if it's only one religion, then the reception sometimes is, oh, okay, they're defending themselves. And rightly so. Every religious community has a right to do so. But if it's done multi-religiously, then it's about a higher level principle about the society where one lives, the harmony we want to actually achieve. And together we want to work towards decreasing the injustices in whichever direction they may be happening. And that's much more powerful. And politicians, especially in secular, but also in other kinds of situations in countries around the world, tend to be more open to listening when it's a multi-religious group that is more representative of the diversity of their own society.
Of course. And I always say when a human is born, they don't know the differences. Like as a child, you don't know what the difference is.
Exactly.
You just look at a person for who they are.
Yeah.
You don't look at them at anything else. Like as we grow older, we are taught the differences.
Yeah.
And that's the key of, like, let's say it's a difference of learning to see the changes and learning to be curious, to learn about the changes and to actually come to a common ground. So that will move us then to the next question on what do you believe are the conditions that enable effective interreligious interfaith dialogue?
I partly answered some of those already, but let me use the opportunity to add a few more things. Part of the conditions is to understand that sometimes the dialogue is one of those situations. It's about like educating children. You know, there are days when it's wonderful. It works. They're hearing, they're listening, they're aware, they're transforming, whatnot. And there are the days where they resist, you know, and they go the other direction.
Shut the door.
And it's always as if they never understood or remembered what you told them yesterday. It's a back and forth. And so developing the patience to flow with that a cycle sometimes of back and forth in trust, mistrust, and it is really one of the challenges, and therefore requires sort of working on oneself and not giving up when you think that that's it. I cannot move on anymore. I cannot do this dialogue anymore. Some people begin the dialogue on a common purpose of harmony, meaning identifying the common values, the common basis that they share. And when they do that, and once they achieve that, they're happy because then they feel like they are better understood and they understand others and they're willing to, there's a common basis that they can work from. It's essential. But sometimes this approach towards more harmony is not necessarily addressing some of the difficult situations or what some people call sometimes the elephant in the room. And there you move towards a different kind of dialogue, which is a little bit more it focuses more on addressing the deeper challenges that confront the relationships between the different religious communities and sometimes their secular environment, again, depending on what is the nature of the society in which one lives. Or the international situations, different kinds of situations worldwide. There are so many human challenges today, the climate crisis, et cetera, and the wars that we know. But in addressing those, if people are willing to do so, again, that's kind of like it's like dialogue 2.0, you know, it's like a second degree, deeper dialogue that is more challenging. But it is my really deep belief that is vital today. By individuals in their own name to create spaces to meet their neighbors, to make that possible, and also with a variety of different organizations at all levels, from the municipal all the way up to the global. We need those endeavors. They exist. We have intergovernmental organizations that exist, like the International Dialogue Center, CAICID, based in Lisbon and whatnot. We have international that are multi-religious. Then you have international initiatives, as has come out of Abu Dhabi, with the relationship primarily between Pope Francis and Sheikh Al-Azhar Al-Tayyib, Ahmed Al-Tayyib, Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayyib, and together they developed 5 years ago, a little bit more than 5 years ago, thanks to the hosting in Abu Dhabi of this international meeting that led to the Common Fraternity Declaration, the Universal Fraternity Declaration, and that's really essential. But it came out of a bilateral Christian-Muslim endeavor that seeks to be more than that, of course, because of course there is the Abrahamic Forum House in Abu Dhabi that is there to promote primarily better Abrahamic relations, which are so crucial today. Yet, this is a subset of the broader, diverse, multi-religious dialogue purposes and initiatives that are being done, but mostly by NGOs, international non-governmental organizations, such as Religions for Peace International, which is the largest one, with chapters in over 80 countries around the world, and regional councils and all of this. And then you have, of course, sort of the Congress of Leaders of world and traditional religions and traditions. That includes indigenous communities as well. That's coming out of Kazakhstan, and that's a different Central Asian effort. And so different parts of the world actually endeavor to develop sort of what makes sense to them to reach out to that multiplicity of religious and spiritual traditions. Because we also learn as we do dialogue that many communities don't necessarily think of their own organizations or own worldviews as religious. They think of it either as spiritual or as what many indigenous communities in the Americas, where I come from, they talk about cosmovisions of the world. And therefore, even the language itself is not a language we necessarily agree upon. So there's a lot to work on when we do dialogue globally, as well as all the way down to our local neighborhoods, or even sometimes within our own buildings where we live, or streets. So those are part of the challenges of dialogue today. But the good news is we have official tools which are accessible for free online that many organizations have developed and make accessible. We have declarations that are wonderful, that actually provide a basis for a lot of those ways in which we think about the history and the contemporary needs to dialogue and to learn from each other and to work collaboratively to improve the quality of our well-being as human beings wherever we are. So those are just several of the pieces, among others.
Talking about the initiatives that you just discussed, what are the new initiatives in the dialogue of the churches of Canada with both Islam and Muslims?
There's first of all, on the Christian front, Christians are the majority of within the Canadian population, although there is an increasing number of people who do not self-identify religiously at all, especially towards the more western part of the country. Irrespective of that, you still have a slight majority of people who do identify. How much they practice is a different degree of importance. But more importantly, at an organizational level, there's the National Council of Churches of Canada that groups most of the mainline Christian communities. In a way, it's a bit like a sub-branch of the World Council of Churches at a global level. Within that context, they have most of the Christian organizations within Canada members. Not every organization, because you have some organizations within Christianity, as, by the way, with other religious organizations, there are organizations that do not necessarily work ecumenically, to use a Christian term, or intra-religiously, to use a broader sort of term, and therefore they're not involved. So, but nevertheless, I think the National Council of Churches represents a majority of the Christians, together with its close collaboration with the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops, which is the primary, the largest religious community are Catholics, and they also have their National Council of Bishops, and together with the National Council of Churches, which is more Protestant mainline churches, they together have this ecumenical dialogue that has these units or these programs of dialogue. Some of them are bilateral, some of them are multi-religious. Some bilaterals include, for example, dialogue with Indigenous communities, which is something that Canadians are highly aware of and work really hard. After we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came out with several recommendations, dozens of them, and one of them, of course, is to increase dialogue between religious communities and Indigenous communities across the country. That's one bilateral kind of dialogue. Another one is an old dialogue of Jewish-Christian dialogue, which goes back to even before the Second World War, because we had already established a committee at a Canadian level in the 1920s, a bit like the United States, but it was formalized from 1948 onwards. Then we have, of course, a dialogue which started more in the 1960s with Muslims, a bilateral Christian-Muslim dialogue. And some of these efforts have developed until COVID into the efforts to try to see if we can come up with, for example, a website which I help participate in with many others from the Canadian Council of Imams and the and the Council of Catholic Bishops. And that's one example of effort at moving towards developing tools to have the communities at the local level interact with each other, not at the national, high religious leaders level. No. Provide tools to make it meaningful and useful at the local level. And of course, there are many, many local initiatives, neighborhood, citywide, and that's really great. One of them at an Abrahamic level initially was in Montreal. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, they realized that what came out of the Ministry of Health of Quebec, the province of Quebec, did not take into account at all the specificity of the religious people to have access to their religious communities. Mm-hmm. And so there had to be a dialogue, and so Abrahamic representatives from the Greater Montreal area came together in a table de concertation interreligieuse, an interreligious dialogue table, I'll call it. And they primarily dialogue with the Ministry of Health, and that became a new form of policy/religious leaders dialogue in order to provide sort of nuances in what came out in terms of orders of the Ministry of Health to make sure that at least some of the needs of the religious communities could be better integrated and respected when possible, given that the health, of course, concerns were the first one and needed to be prioritized as such. So you see, there are many different kinds of dialogues that are happening. And today there's also dialogue of solidarity on the basis of a variety of different unfolding development internationally. And it's interesting that you cannot cut things in a black and white as if there's only two sides. And you have people within the different communities, Jewish Muslim communities, for example, that want to come closer together to address some of these issues rather than simply think and generalize and stereotype that all the people on the other side are of one opinion. That's never true.
True.
And therefore, creating those spaces of interpersonal and interorganizational collaborations that include demonstrating publicly about it, to show the public, to get the press involved in covering sort of those realities that show that at least some people are able to talk, dialogue, and do something in solidarity with certain values that they share in common, certain values of justice, of security for everybody, and so on and so forth, are important elements and issues that I think dialogue is the best tool to use to move in that direction. And we greatly need it for so many challenges that humanity faces today.
Of course. That's going to move us on to the last question. What dilemmas may arise within interfaith dialogue, and how might these be handled by those involved?
What? Sorry.
Dilemmas.
Dilemmas. Okay.
Yes.
I think one of the dilemma is to understand that the more official the dialogue, the more it tends to be carried out by men, because traditionally most of the religious leaders in most of religions still today are men. And therefore, we need to make sure that even in more official dialogues, that there is a way in which we think of religious leadership, not just in a normal sense of how the religious organizations have appointed themselves for centuries, if not millennium, men to positions of power, but also to expand that and to invite maybe to have also a woman representative by that same organizations. And often those women don't have the same official positions, of course, and that's to be respected because each religious organization needs to self-organize themselves, and they must have the freedom to do so. But as organizers of spaces of official dialogue, it's important to sometimes create incentives to try to increase the participation of women that are playing important roles in those communities, but not necessarily with a title. Although some of these titles, by the way, are beginning to appear,
yes,
and which is wonderful. But so that's one challenge. When you're dealing with non-official dialogue, it's easier to create and invite and try to aim to have a balanced representation of men and women, both in those that you invite to speak, but also those to invite to participate in the dialogue, broadly speaking. So that's one thing. A second challenge, it has to do with age. Because, again, if we have leadership, it tends to be older people. That's of course, right? It's natural. But the largest percentage of the world population today is below 30 years old. And so you have to make sure that, especially when you work at global institutional level, you have to make sure to bring more younger generations into the picture. And that, of course, trickles down all the way to local context. Yeah. Although, of course, some societies have a means that is higher in age than other societies. And this is where you have sort of, part of the initiatives in the Gulf states where the population average is it's much younger. You have great sort of, there's a greater sensitivity to make and create those opportunities of dialogue as intergenerational opportunities. That's a second challenge, which I find wonderful. And I think that in some ways, some of what I've seen in parts of the world like yours are, in fact, better done in general than some other parts of the world. So that's a second challenge. A third challenge, of course, I would say in general, is to recognize that religious communities, because of their histories and because of the numbers that some of them have, and Christians and Muslims are by far the two largest groups, demographically speaking, around the world, then sometimes unexpectedly or unknowingly, they forget to be a little bit more inclusive of smaller religious communities in their midst, especially indigenous communities that have been often trampled on through colonial periods, as well as current majority religious traditions, not understanding and rejecting and wanting to convert them. And so that openness to smaller communities, as well as indigenous in particular, especially given their knowledge and their connection to environmental sensitivities and what I call local knowledge in relationship to nature, is absolutely vital today. So everybody, whether majority or minority, has to learn from each other. We have all something to contribute to each other, whatever our age, whatever our gender, whatever our nationality, religion, or none. The religious people also have to learn from those who are not, for whatever reason. There are dynamics there too that we can grow from, and we must create that learning how to develop the respect for differences. That allows us to, I think, eventually better collaborate in addressing more inclusively our challenges, and eventually to diminish the power dynamics, make them a little bit fairer, and eventually come up with better solutions.
Thank you, Professor Patrice. So as we draw this episode of Trending Echoes to a close, we reflect on the profound insights shared by our distinguished guest here today, Professor Patrice. Remember, our journey through interreligious dialogue isn't just about tolerance, like I said. It's about cultivating empathy, fostering respect, and forging connections that transcend boundaries. Join us next time as we continue to navigate the intricate tapestry of our world today. Until then, let us all remain curious, embrace compassion, and let the echoes of understanding resonate far and wide. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Aliazia. Shukran jazilan. Wa ila liqa, inshallah.